So last week I preached on the passage immediately before this. It's the story of how Jacob wrestled God or a man or an angel. The text is pretty ambiguous, and we're never exactly clear, but in some sense he wrestled with God, possibly through an angel of God. And I did that on the 7th, and then on the 10th of this month, the Babylon Bee had this article. It said there was a rematch, that the angel returned for a rematch against Jacob, and oh my, he's got a steel chair. And so it repictured that wrestling match from however long ago in our modern context with the World Wrestling Entertainment style theatrics and beating people up with chairs and so forth. So I had to laugh at that, and I wanted to share it with you. But it illustrates something about the passages we've been looking at as we've studied the life of Jacob, which is that the context is pretty different, right? It was 3,000, nearly 4,000 years ago. There's a lot of stuff that was different. We don't have goats and camels today, and so there's a lot of things where we don't even know how could you possibly have a wrestling match without climbing back into the ring with a chair. There's a lot of ways that these stories are different from our culture so much that we struggle. We have to actually take a minute and think something through in order to get an idea of, okay, right now I see that, yes, that does relate to my life, but sometimes it's an effort to get there. But today's lesson is painfully familiar. It's so easy for us to understand what's going on in our reading today that we don't have that difficulty of the lost in translation aspects of it. So I want to look at it, and we'll talk about it as we go forward. But this idea this is the last we're going to see of Jacob. So we're going to close our conversation today. The story of Jacob is not done. It goes on really through the end of the book of Genesis. There's 50 chapters, so it goes all the way to the end. But and in some sense, it's the story of Israel, so it's still going on today because Jacob is Israel, as we found in the passage with the metal chair. So it still goes on today. But Jacob is less and less central to the story because after this, we start focusing more and more on Jacob's children, so his daughter and his 12 sons, and they become more and more the center of the story. So we're going to conclude today, but it is this passage, as I said, that is so painfully familiar to us, and so we'll be looking at it in that light. And the place we're picking things up at is the story of how Esau and Jacob are reunited. When we last heard from Esau was planning to murder Jacob, and he had a good reason. Jacob had extracted his birthright from him, driven a really hard price when Esau was vulnerable, and then, if that wasn't enough, he then stole his brother's blessing. He stole the blessing that his father was going to give Esau. And so Esau had enough, and Esau said, well, when the old man dies, I'm going to kill him. And so Jacob flees. Jacob flees 600 miles to the very northern end of the Fertile Crescent. And so he then spends the next 14 years acquiring a family. So he marries one girl, and then he marries her sister, and then he has children with them and with their slave girls. And he comes back, when he comes back, as we'll see, he's got a big family. He then spends the following 6 years becoming rich. So he doesn't just have a big family, he's got vast herds of cattle and camels and goats and sheep. He becomes fabulously rich while he's away. But while he's away, he has a vision, and God tells him to go back to Canaan, where he came from. And so he does, and he sends a message ahead of him. He sends a message to Esau saying, hey, hope we can get along. And where the story picks up is somebody comes back to Jacob and says, yeah, Esau's coming to greet you, and he's got 400 men with him. And so we're in this moment of tension, which actually the writer has prolonged by telling us about that encounter with God. We're waiting to find out what's going to happen. has Esau changed? Is Esau forgiven Jacob for everything Jacob did wrong? And in a sense, we know the answer, right? As readers of this, this is the book. This is Israel's book. This is the book that his children wrote and crafted and became ultimately the Hebrew Scriptures. And so we know somehow or another it worked out for Israel, but we don't know how. We don't know what happened when Israel and Esau finally met. And so that's the place where we're at. We're eager to find out what's going to happen. And we pick things up in verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, Jacob looked up and saw Esau approaching with... Do we have the... Oh, there. He saw Esau approaching, and he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 women servants. He put the servants and their children first. All right. Are these wrong? And Rachel and Joseph last. All right, I'm going to quit looking at these for a minute. He himself went in front of them and bowed in the ground 7 times as he was approaching his brother. So he's going to meet Esau, who's coming to meet him. So he bows to the ground 7 times. In ancient Oriental cultures, that would have been the maximum. That would be like a slave before a king. And so he bows 7 times, and Esau is not having any of that. Esau runs to meet him, throws his arms around his neck, kisses him, and they weep. And we just need to pause for a minute. I think Christians in particular, when we hear this, it should ring in our ears. We should be saying, wait a minute, that reminds me of a story. It reminds me of Jesus' most famous parable, the parable of the prodigal son. This is the way Jesus describes that. So there is a man who is injured by his son. His son goes off and spends everything that he gave him in dissolute living. And finally the son comes back. And Jesus puts it this way, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. And the father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Kills the fatted calf and so forth. I think Jesus drew on the story of Esau because he knew his audience would be familiar with it. He knew that his audience would say, that reminds me of our story, the story of how Esau came and ran to forgive our ancestor Israel. And I think Jesus said, yeah, I want you to realize God is like that. God is like that to the greatest degree possible, that when we come back to God, God runs to greet us. And so Jesus is drawing on this familiar cultural story to say that that's what people should be like because that's what God is like. And so, the first lesson obviously here is to be like that. Not because Esau was like that, although that would be a good thing, but because God is like that. Jesus teaches us this is what we are to be like. We are to be forgiving the way God is forgiving. So be forgiving. So absolutely I'm foursquare for forgiveness. But forgiveness is actually, it's incredibly hard. If you've ever had to forgive somebody who really wronged you, it is incredibly hard. But it's easy in one sense, right? Because it makes sense. If you think about it, forgiveness is really all you can do sometimes. I've read this from different places. I don't know who actually first said it, but forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past, right? There's nothing that can be done. It's in the past. All you can do is hang on to it or let go of it. So forgiveness makes sense. It's easy in that sense. It makes sense. Marianne Williamson said this, being unforgiving is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. So being forgiven it's not easy, but it's easy in a sense because it makes sense. It goes with the grain of what we understand about ourselves and about other people. But being forgiven is actually sometimes harder. And what we see in this lesson is really a lesson about being forgiven. And so, if people have wronged you and you need to forgive them, that's great. Do. Jesus is all on board with that. So do that. But there's also a lesson here about being forgiven. And I think that that's useful to us in our everyday relationships, and it's also useful to us in understanding our relationship before God. So I want to look at the rest of this passage in that light, from the point of view of what can we learn about being forgiven. You know, the problem with being forgiven is it's so easy to deny it, right? To say, well, I don't need, I didn't do anything wrong, right? I don't need to be forgiven. Or if we realize we do, then what we might want to do is we might want to kind of come up with some way of saying, well, it's not all my fault, or it wasn't as bad as all that, or I had reasons, or there was some context that makes it different, right? It's very easy to get into this business of trying to water it down and say, no, I didn't do anything all that wrong. So it's very easy. And we're going to see there's a different thing that we can do here. So the two brothers, they're reunited, they hug, they kiss, they weep. And then Esau looks up and he sees the women and children that Jacob has arranged. He's arranged, there's 20 people in his group. He may have some other servants or something along with them. He's got 20 people he needs to introduce, and so he's arranged them, as we saw, in terms of their rank within the family. So first the servants and their children, then the wife he doesn't love and her children, and then finally the wife he loves and her son Joseph. So he arranges them, and Jacob introduces them now to Esau. The women servants and their children came forward and bowed down. Then Leah and her servants also came forward and bowed, and afterward Joseph and Rachel came forward and bowed. So they've now been introduced. This is the family you acquired while you were off in Haran these last 20 years. Glad to meet them. And then he says this. He says, so I encountered a bunch of animals on my way here, right? You sent 200 goats, 200 sheep, 100, hundreds of animals, camels, cattle. You sent this huge gift to me. And I encountered them yesterday as I was coming this way. What's the meaning of all that? And Jacob says, to ask for my master's kindness. He says, I'm looking to buy you off. I want to pay for forgiveness. And Esau says, keep your goats. He says, I already have plenty, my brother. I was hoping that we were brothers. I was hoping that we could reunite on the grounds of being brothers. But if you just want to kind of paper it over with some goats, keep your goats. And there is a huge lesson there for us. So often we say, well, look, I'll make it up to you. We try to, this is so easy to do because we want to minimize what it is we're taking from the other person. And, the lesson here is obvious. Don't try to buy forgiveness. And in particular, don't try to buy forgiveness from God. Accept it as a gift. Don't say, God, thank you for forgiving me. I'm going to somehow make it better. And it's like, no, you can't. Just accept your forgiveness. But do that for your brothers and sisters too. Don't corrupt the moment by bringing money into it or any other kind of payback. Don't buy forgiveness. So Jacob answers him. He says, I got ahead of myself. He says, to ask for my master's kindness. And I don't know, is he saying, I'm still hoping for this? I'm still hoping to buy you off? Or is he admitting, I didn't know what kind of reception I would get, and I was thinking I might need to buy you off? So I don't know exactly what was going on in Jacob's head, but one way or the other, he says that's what the plan was. But Esau says, no, I don't need it. And now Jacob says, no, okay, please do me the kindness of accepting my gift, seeing your face is like seeing God's face since you've accepted me so warmly. He says, take this present I brought because God has been generous to me and I have everything I need. So he says, take it as a gift, not as negotiations and what will it take to get you to forgive me, but just as a gift. And he says, take this present. And it's interesting, the word present is the same as the word for blessing. And so he may be saying, I'm trying to give back the blessing I stole from you. So maybe he's saying that too. But he is saying, God has been generous to me and I have everything I need. This is exactly what Jacob could never say before. Jacob was always the heel grasper, the one who wanted a little bit more, who was always trying to work an angle. He says, God has given me everything I need. And so there's a place to say, all right, I did you wrong, and I need to make restitution. And that can be on either side of forgiveness. They may send the envelope back unopened, right? But there's a place to ask for forgiveness and say, here, I'm trying to make things better. But don't make it at the moment of forgiveness. Instead, do it later. Later, do what you can. Show them you're a different person. Show them that God has changed you, and you, where you used to be grasping, now you're generous. Do what you can to make amends for what you've done wrong. So do what you can later. And then the rest of this is, I think, maybe in some ways the most fascinating part of the story. It's easy to kind of, sum it up, right? Esau says, okay, well, let's break camp. I'll set out. I'll go with you. And Jacob says, no, politely. But he says, my master knows the children aren't strong, and I'm responsible for the nursing flocks and the cattle. If I push them hard for even one day, all of the flocks will die. My master, go on ahead of your servant, but I've got to take it easy, going only as fast as the animals in front of me, and the children are able to go until I meet you in Seir. And Esau said, well, I can give you some help. I have 400 men, right? I can help you. And Jacob says, why should you do this since my master has already been so kind to me? And what is fascinating about this is that's the last thing that is recorded between Jacob and Esau. Jacob says, my master has been so kind to me. And then they split up. So that day Esau returns on the road to Seir, and Jacob travels to Sukkoth. So Seir is to the south. So they're on if you imagine the Jordan River is going north to south, right now they're on the eastern side of, pat my head and rub my tummy. So Jordan River here, they're over here on the east side of it. And Esau goes south. He goes to Seir. He goes down below south of the Dead Sea. And Jacob goes west to Sukkoth. And as far as we know, they never talk again. Jacob says, I'll meet up with you. Let them go until I meet you in Seir. But we don't know if he ever did. As far as the scriptures teach us, this is the last thing Jacob ever says to Esau. He says, my master has been so kind to me. And what is so fascinating about that this is the last thing that is remembered, is Edom, the region around Mount Seir down in the south, is a historic enemy of Israel. And I say this, and it's an evergreen statement, that there was a time in the Middle East when people didn't get along. Sometimes countries fought each other. And for 3,500, 4,000 years, that's been going on. And Edom is one of the historic enemies of Israel. Israel has always looked at Edom and said, we hate those guys. Why do we hate them? Because they've been terrible to us. In the book of Obadiah the prophet describes how when a foreign country conquered Jerusalem, he says, well, what goes around comes around. He says, how Esau has been looted. He's looking ahead. He says, Edom's going to face the same trouble. His treasures have been taken away. And talking directly to Edom, he says, you stood nearby, strangers carried off Israel's wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You too were like one of them. You acted as bad as the foreigners did. These conquerors who conquered Jerusalem. And he says, the prophet Obadiah says, there will be no one left of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. This is the intensity of the bitterness between Israel and Edom. That you will get what's coming to you too. That's the place they're at. And what is amazing to me in this story is that it's Israel's book. Israel wrote they wrote it, they literally made copies of it for centuries until, the printing press. This is their book, the Hebrew Scriptures. And they had, day to day, every reason to hate the Edomites. But they never edited out the story about Esau. They held on to it. They remembered Jacob's words when he said, my master has been so kind to me. They held on in the face of provocation. We hate these guys. They held on to the possibility that someday things could get better, that things were not always this way. And in fact, when we did wrong, they were good to us. And so one last thing we can do in the area of forgiveness is hang on to it. If we've been forgiven, don't let go of that. Hold on to that thought, because maybe things will get better. And maybe we just need to remember, yes, they're terrible people, they've done us wrong, but people are complicated. And they're not as simple as just our enemies. They're our brothers. And so hang on to that. Hang on to that moment of forgiveness, the time when somebody did something for you that they didn't need to. Jesus teaches us we should be forgiving because God is forgiving. And that's the part we understand, because it's just toxic to be unforgiving. But being forgivable is even more important. And that means not to try to bargain for forgiveness, but just to accept it when it's offered. And only then to be in a place where we can say, look, I've changed. I'm not who I used to be. And here's what I'd like to do to address any particular harm I've done. But to hang on to it, to remember this moment may not last, but I'm going to hold on to it as long as I can. There's so much here that I think we can relate to in our own families, in our other relationships at work, at school, down the block, and across the world. And in light of the events yesterday, I think the thought of being forgiving people is more appropriate than ever. The people we disagree with aren't our enemies. And if they've done wrong things, we need to remember that they are our brothers and sisters, and that our enemies are not flesh and blood. Let's pray. Father in heaven, you know the difficulties that we have in our families. We put up barriers that keep the rest of the world outside, and we don't give them the tools they need to aggravate us. But our families are inside those barriers, and they know exactly what to do. And sometimes they do it. Sometimes we do it to them. Lord, help us to be like Esau, this patriarch of Israel's historic enemy, to have the upper hand and to forgive. And help us to be like Jacob, to receive forgiveness, not just from our brothers and sisters, but ultimately, Lord, from you. And help us to be changed people because of it. We ask all these things in the name of Christ our Savior. Amen.